Hello, everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now, just get cozy and enjoy. You'd never expect to see something like that. I didn't. I had lived in my house for about 5 years, and nothing strange had ever happened. At least, nothing like this. I guess I should start from the beginning, though. My name's Ryan, and I moved into this old house just outside the city when I got promoted at work. It's a modest place. 2 stories, a big yard, the usual. The kind of house that feels like it's been standing forever, with creaky floors and drafty windows. But it had its charm. I liked it. Well, I used to like it. It all began one normal Tuesday morning. I was heading out for work, just like any other day. I had my keys in one hand, coffee in the other, when I caught my reflection in the living room window. It wasn't strange to see myself. Anyone would, with the morning sun bouncing off the glass. But what caught my attention was the way my reflection moved. It waved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I had moved my hand without realizing it. I even turned back to double check. But there it was, standing there, waving. My hand wasn't up anymore. My reflection had acted on its own. I shook it off. A glitch in my brain, I told myself. Something I imagined. I locked the door and left, trying to convince myself it wasn't worth thinking about. But it happened again. The next morning, same routine, same weird reflection waving back at me as I stood there, frozen in confusion. This time, I didn't just leave. I stepped closer to the window, peered into it, and watched my reflection closely. Nothing. My reflection was just that, an ordinary reflection. I turned to leave, but as I pulled my keys out of my pocket, there it was again. My reflection lifted its hand and waved goodbye. My heart pounded in my chest. I slammed the door behind me and didn't look back. Days went by, and the waving continued. Every time I left, my reflection acted like it was seeing me off. The strangest part was that it only happened when I was walking out the door. If I checked the mirror inside, everything was fine. But as soon as I stepped outside, the reflection came to life, as if it was enjoying some private joke I wasn't in on. I tried telling myself it didn't matter. Reflections don't move on their own, right? It was all in my head. But then it got worse. One evening, I stayed late at work. It had been a rough day, and I was tired. When I got home, the streetlights were flickering, and my house loomed in the distance. Something about it felt off, like it wasn't my home anymore. The place looked darker than usual, like the shadows had grown thicker and heavier in my absence. I didn't even want to glance at the window, but my eyes couldn't help themselves. There, staring back at me, was my reflection. But this time, it wasn't waving. It was just standing there, smiling. And not a friendly smile either. It was wide, almost too wide, like it knew something I didn't. I backed away, feeling a chill run down my spine. It felt like my own reflection was mocking me, waiting for me to crack. I tried to ignore it, but that smile, it stayed with me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my reflection doing things I wasn't. Walking around the house, watching me sleep, smiling in the darkness. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. The kind that tells you something's wrong even before your brain catches up. I was dreading leaving the house, but I had to go to work. I couldn't let a stupid window scare me out of my own life. I got dressed, ate breakfast, and went to the front door like it was any other day. But my hand hesitated on the doorknob. I didn't want to see it again. Didn't want to see him again. That's what it felt like now. Like the thing in the window wasn't me anymore. It was him. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. It was just a reflection. Just my imagination. I opened the door and stepped outside. He waved. It was so casual, so normal, like we were friends. Like we were saying goodbye before I went off to work. Except this time, there was no smile. His face was blank, emotionless. It was worse than the smile somehow. It was like he didn't care anymore, like I wasn't even important enough to mock. I backed away from the window, heart racing. My reflection stood there, frozen, staring at me with that dead expression. It wasn't moving anymore, but I swear, I felt like it was watching me, like it was waiting for something. I didn't leave the house that day. Instead, I sat in my living room, blinds drawn, trying to figure out what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of stress-induced hallucination? It didn't feel like a breakdown. It felt real. Too real, through the glass, smiling that same crooked smile. And I waved back. Because now, I was just the reflection. I found plenty of wild theories, but none of them made sense. Nothing explained why my reflection was waving, smiling, alive. I tried calling a friend, but as soon as I started talking about it, I realized how crazy it sounded. I hung up before I could finish. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, mentally drained. I crawled into bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever feel normal again. Then the knocking started. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was almost midnight, and my neighborhood wasn't exactly lively after dark. I froze, waiting to see if the knocks would come again. Knock, knock, knock. I forced myself out of bed and crept to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something stopped me from opening it. Instead, I moved toward the window beside the door, where I could peek outside without being seen. My reflection was there, staring at me from the other side of the glass. But something was wrong. He wasn't standing in the house anymore. He was outside, standing on the porch, looking in at me, his face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. He was supposed to be inside the house, not out there, but he was outside, knocking on the door, waiting for me to let him in. My legs gave out, and I fell to the floor, shaking. The knocking continued, slow, deliberate. He knew I was there. He knew I could see him. I stayed there, paralyzed, until morning. The knocks never stopped, not until the sun came up. The next day, I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I stayed inside, every curtain drawn, every window covered. I wasn't going to let him in. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. Days blurred together. I didn't leave the house. I barely slept. Every night, the knocking came, and every night, my reflection stood outside, waiting. I tried calling for help. Friends, family, nobody picked up. When I finally reached out to a neighbor, they told me I'd been seen leaving the house. They said they saw me walking down the street, going about my business like nothing was wrong. But that wasn't me. I hadn't stepped foot outside in days. Someone else was out there, someone who looked exactly like me. The worst part, the neighbors said I seemed happy, friendlier than usual. They liked this version of me better. That's when I realized he wasn't just a reflection anymore. He was living my life. I had no idea how to stop it. The more time I spent inside, the stronger he seemed to get. People started forgetting about me. At first, it was small things. A friend not remembering our last conversation. My boss saying I missed a meeting I knew I hadn't scheduled. But it got worse. My name started disappearing from records. Photos of me were missing. It was like I was being erased. One night, as the knocking echoed through the house, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to end this. I grabbed a hammer and went to the window. If the reflection was gone, maybe he'd be gone too. I smashed the glass, but it didn't shatter. The window didn't even crack. Instead, my reflection stared at me, grinning. Not waving this time, just watching me with those cold, mocking eyes. The more I swung, the louder the knocking got, until it felt like the whole house was shaking. And then it stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought I'd won. I thought it was over. But when I turned around, he was inside, standing in the hallway, wearing my clothes, with my face. But it wasn't me. I could tell by the way he moved. Too fluid, too perfect. He was more me than I ever was. He smiled, that same smile I'd seen in the window, and waved. I backed away, trying to get to the door, but he was faster. Before I knew it, he was standing in front of me, blocking my way. His face twisted into something almost unrecognizable, like he was stretching, pushing himself into a form that didn't quite fit. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but I couldn't move. "Thanks," he said, his voice just like mine, but smoother, colder. "I've been waiting for this." And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. I was inside the window, looking out. My reflection, the real me, was living my life. He waved at me through the glass, smiling that same crooked smile. And I waved back, because now I was just the reflection. I was just an ordinary kid. Nothing special about me, really. I went to school, played video games, and hung out with friends on weekends. Life was predictable, maybe even a little boring. That was until the day I found the mask. It was one of those random weekends when I was out exploring the woods near my house. I liked to wander off the beaten path sometimes, letting my imagination run wild as I pretended I was on some great adventure. That's when I stumbled across it, half buried in the dirt near an old gnarled tree. At first, it looked like some cheap Halloween mask, black and smooth, with strange markings etched into it. The eyes were hollow, like they were waiting for something. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like it was calling out to me. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, brushing away the dirt. There was something oddly heavy about it, like it carried more than just its weight. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Curiosity got the better of me. I held the mask up to my face, and before I even knew what I was doing, slipped it on. The world around me shifted. It wasn't immediate, more like a slow, creeping sensation, like the mask was sinking into my skin, merging with me. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the strange feeling, but when I looked down at my hands, they weren't mine. They were older, rougher, like they belonged to someone else. Panic shot through me, and I ripped the mask off. The transformation didn't last, but the memory of it stuck with me. Who had I become? And why did the mask make me feel so different? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The feeling of power that surged through me when I wore it. The way it made me someone else. I didn't tell anyone, not even my parents. It felt like my secret, like something too strange to share. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stay away. The next day, I found myself sneaking back to the woods, the mask tucked under my jacket. I couldn't resist. When I put it on again, the change was more intense. This time, I didn't just feel different, I was different. My reflection in the nearby stream was unrecognizable. I was taller, stronger, and my eyes, they didn't belong to me. They looked darker, colder, as if whoever I had become was someone far more dangerous. I didn't take the mask off right away. For the first time in my life, I felt powerful, like I could do anything. I wandered through the woods for hours, enjoying the strange new strength surging through me. But eventually I knew I had to return home. I couldn't let anyone see me like this. When I finally removed the mask, something was wrong. My face looked like mine again, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it felt like a piece of me had been left behind, like the mask had taken something from me. As the days passed, I found myself wearing the mask more and more, every time I put it on. It became harder to remember who I was without it. I'd look in the mirror and see someone else staring back, someone stronger, smarter, but colder too. It was thrilling at first, but then the nightmares started. In my dreams, I was trapped in a dark, endless void, surrounded by shadows wearing masks of their own. They whispered to me, their voices like wind through dead trees. "You're not yourself anymore. You're becoming one of us." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the worst part was, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dreams were right. Every time I wore the mask, I felt less like myself. My memories became fuzzy, my thoughts scattered, and the mask. It started to feel like it was a part of me, like I couldn't live without it. One night, I made the mistake of falling asleep with it on. When I woke up, I didn't recognize the room I was in. It was my bedroom, but it felt foreign, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time, I couldn't remember who I was. My own name slipped through my fingers like sand, and all I could think about was the mask that had become me. I stared at the reflection, trying to grasp any memory, any detail that would anchor me to who I once was. But there was nothing. No name, no history, just the face of a stranger. My face. A face that didn't belong to me. I yanked the mask off in a panic, hoping it would bring everything back. But the sensation of being someone else lingered. It felt like I had crossed a line, one I could never uncross. For days, I avoided the mask, hiding it in the back of my closet under piles of clothes, hoping that out of sight meant out of mind. But it didn't work. The mask haunted my thoughts, like a constant hum in the back of my brain. Every time I passed by my closet, I felt its pull. And every night, the nightmares grew worse. The masked shadows in my dreams were becoming more familiar. I hear them whisper my name. Not the name I had forgotten, but a new one. A name that felt both alien and right. They were welcoming me into their world, urging me to join them fully. And the more I resisted, the stronger their voices became. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the mask from the closet, the cold surface somehow comforting now. I was done fighting. When I slipped it on this time, there was no slow transformation, no gradual shift. It was immediate. The mask melted into my skin like it had always belonged there, and my reflection in the mirror smiled, but it wasn't me smiling. It was someone else, something else, and for the first time, I didn't care. The next few days were a blur. I wore the mask constantly, only taking it off when absolutely necessary. But every time I removed it, it became harder and harder to remember why I should. Life without the mask felt dull, colorless, like I was only half alive. With it, I was powerful, unstoppable, and most of all, I felt like I belonged. That's when people started noticing. My parents asked if I was feeling okay, said I seemed different. My friends at school avoided me, their eyes wide with fear whenever I spoke. I didn't care. I was beyond their world now. The mask had given me something none of them could ever understand: control. But then, something strange happened. One afternoon, while I was staring at myself in the mirror, admiring the changes, I noticed something off. My face, the one the mask had given me, didn't look as smooth as it used to. There were cracks forming, tiny fractures running across my cheeks and forehead, like the surface of an old weathered statue. I reached up, tracing one of the cracks with my finger, and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The skin didn't feel like skin anymore. It felt like porcelain. Panic gripped me again, stronger this time. I ripped the mask off and stared at my real face, my old face, but it was wrong. My own reflection was starting to crack too, just like the mask. The fractures that had started with the mask were spreading across my actual face, and no matter how much I rubbed at them, they wouldn't go away. I tried to stop wearing the mask after that, but it was too late. I couldn't resist. Every time I looked at my reflection, the cracks seemed to get deeper, and the urge to put the mask back on grew stronger. I knew what was happening. I was becoming the mask. And worse, I didn't care. The mask had made me forget who I was, but it had given me something else in return. Power. A purpose. I was no longer just some kid living an ordinary, boring life. I was something more, something greater. And if I had to lose myself to keep that feeling, so be it. The last time I took the mask off, I couldn't find my face anymore. The cracks had spread too far, and beneath them, there was nothing, just a hollow shell, empty and lifeless. I stared into the mirror, but all I saw was the mask's reflection staring back at me. That's when I realized the truth. The mask wasn't something I had found. It had found me. It had been waiting, biding its time until someone like me came along. Someone weak, someone who needed it. And now it was done waiting. I tried to fight it, tried to remember who I was before the mask, but there was nothing left. My name, my past, my life, all of it was gone, swallowed by the mask. And as I put it on for the final time, I understood why. I was never meant to take it off. Days turned into weeks, and no one seemed to notice I was gone. My parents barely looked at me, as if the person they had raised was a distant memory. My friends at school didn't even acknowledge my existence anymore. But that was fine. I didn't need them. The mask had given me a new identity, one that was far more important. The whispers in my dreams became clearer, louder. They called me by my new name, the one I had earned. I belonged to them now, to the world of shadows and forgotten faces. And as the final cracks spread across my reflection, I smiled. I was no longer afraid, because I wasn't me anymore. I was the mask. Darkness had settled over my life, but instead of despair, I felt an odd sense of peace. Whatever I had been before, whoever I was, it didn't matter. I was free now, free from the constraints of my old self, free to be whatever the mask wanted me to be. And as I looked into the mirror one last time, I realized something. There was no going back. You ever had one of those moments where something just feels off? That's how it all started when Rachel and I bought the car. We didn't need it, not really. But we were at this auction, and it looked like a fun thing to do. Bid on an old beat-up car that seemed more rust than metal. The auctioneer called it vintage, but it was really just a shell of what it once was. Still, there was something about it, something neither of us could quite explain. So we bought it. Worst decision we ever made. The first time we drove it, I didn't notice anything too strange. Sure, the seats were stiff, and the engine coughed like it had the flu, but it ran. Rachel was excited about it. She loved the idea of fixing it up, making it ours. She always had a thing for old stuff, things with a history. I guess I should have taken that as a warning. It wasn't until the second drive that the voices started. We were coming back from a late-night grocery run. The sun had long dipped behind the hills, and the road was quiet, almost too quiet. Rachel was sitting next to me, flipping through radio stations that only played static. That's when I heard it, a whisper, low, like someone was sitting right behind me. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. But then it came again. Help me. It was clear as day, a woman's voice, pleading. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Rachel must have sensed something was wrong because she asked if I was okay. I didn't answer. I just kept driving, faster than before, trying to ignore it. Maybe I was just tired. Yeah, that had to be it. But it wasn't. Over the next few days, the voices got louder. Sometimes it was one voice, sometimes more. They'd whisper, laugh, even cry, and always from the backseat. Rachel started hearing them too, though she refused to admit it at first. She'd laugh it off, saying it was probably the wind or the old car creaking. But I could see it in her eyes. She was scared. One night, we decided to take the car for a longer drive, thinking maybe if we just used it more, we'd figure out what was going on. Big mistake. As soon as we hit the open road, the voices started again. This time, they weren't whispers. They were full-on conversations, as if people were sitting behind us, chatting away like we weren't even there. I told you not to come back here. We should have left when we had the chance. She'll never let us go. Rachel turned pale. I glanced at her, and for the first time, she didn't have any excuses. We pulled over on the side of the road, both of us too shaken to drive any further. The car sat there, engine idling, but the voices kept going. I turned around, fully expecting to see someone, or something, sitting in the backseat. but it was empty, just us, and the echoes of those voices. We tried everything to get rid of them. We had the car checked out by a mechanic, but he didn't find anything. I even took it to a priest, hoping for some kind of blessing or exorcism or whatever. He refused to touch it after spending just 5 minutes around the car, said something about restless souls, and left in a hurry. It wasn't long before the voices started saying things that shook us to our core. They knew things about us, things we had never spoken out loud, secrets we'd buried deep, forgotten. One night, one of the voices whispered something so dark, so personal, that Rachel burst into tears right there in the passenger seat. That's when I knew we couldn't keep the car. We tried selling it back, but no one would take it. Word had spread. People knew what was happening, and no one wanted any part of it. So we were stuck with it, and the voices. Every time we drove, it felt like we were being watched, like something was waiting for the right moment to. I don't even know what, but I knew it wasn't good. Then came the last drive. Rachel and I had been fighting more often. The tension from the voices was wearing us down, pulling us apart. She wanted to get rid of the car, even if it meant pushing it off a cliff. I wasn't so sure anymore. A part of me, maybe it was fear, maybe it was curiosity, wanted to know what the voices really wanted. They'd never hurt us, not physically, but it was like they were building up to something. Every time we got in that car, the conversations got darker, angrier, more desperate. That night, we didn't plan on driving anywhere. It was storming outside, the kind of storm that rattles the windows and makes you feel like the world's about to end. But for some reason, I felt drawn to the car. It was parked in our garage, covered with a tarp like we were trying to hide it from ourselves. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had this overwhelming urge to drive, to get in and go somewhere, anywhere. Rachel was asleep on the couch, exhausted from another argument. I grabbed the keys, quietly slipping out the door and into the garage. As soon as I sat in the driver's seat, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air in the car was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel something around me, something I couldn't see but knew was there. The voices didn't waste any time. "Why are you here?" One of them whispered, cold and accusing. "Turn back," another one hissed. But I didn't turn back. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway. The rain was pounding on the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water more than clearing it. I didn't even know where I was going. My hands gripped the wheel, and I kept driving, deeper into the storm, away from the house. The voices were louder now, overlapping each other, filling the car with an overwhelming noise. It was like being in the middle of a crowded room, where everyone was yelling, and you couldn't make out a single word. But then one voice cut through the chaos. It was different this time, calm, almost soothing. "She's waiting for you," it said. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the same empty backseat, but there was a figure. My heart stopped. It was a woman, sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap. She was looking straight ahead, like she didn't even notice me staring at her. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet road, but when I turned around, the back seat was empty again. I was shaking. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't hold on to. Who was she? What did she want? Before I could make sense of it, the calm voice returned, clearer this time. "She'll never let you leave." I wanted to get out of the car, but my body wouldn't listen. My hands were glued to the wheel, my foot pressed down on the gas, even though I wasn't driving anymore. The car was moving on its own, taking me somewhere I didn't want to go. The road narrowed, trees closing in on both sides. The storm raged, but the car kept going, like it was being guided by something unseen. The voices were back, whispering in unison now, chanting something I couldn't understand. My heart raced. My chest tightened, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. And then, in the distance, I saw it, an old, dilapidated house sitting at the end of the road. The headlights barely cut through the fog, but I could see enough. The house was falling apart, windows shattered, the roof caving in. It looked abandoned, but something told me it wasn't. I knew, deep down, that this was where the car had been leading me all along. The car slowed on its own, pulling into the driveway. The voices stopped. The silence was deafening. I couldn't stay in the car any longer. My body finally moved, and I scrambled out, stumbling onto the muddy ground. The house loomed in front of me, dark and menacing. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't just leave either. Someone was in there, waiting. Rachel. I don't know how I knew, but I did. Rachel was in that house. I had left her back at home, asleep on the couch, but somehow she was here now. The woman's voice echoed in my head, soft but insistent. "She's waiting for you." I ran to the door, kicking it open. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Dusty, broken furniture, cobwebs clinging to the corners. But there was no sign of life. No Rachel. Rachel. I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls. But there was no response, only the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was the car. Our car. It shouldn't have been there. I had left it outside, but here it was, sitting in the middle of the room like it had been waiting for me. And in the back seat, Rachel. She was slumped over, her face pale, her eyes closed. I rushed to her, shaking her shoulders. "Rachel, wake up." But she didn't move. My hands trembled as I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. Cold, lifeless. That's when I heard the voice again, right next to my ear this time. "She'll never let you leave." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. The voice echoed in my head, taunting me. Rachel's lifeless body was slumped in the back seat, and I couldn't comprehend how she'd gotten here, or worse, what had happened to her. I bolted for the door, desperate to get out of the house. But as soon as I reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in front of me. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at me as I turned around, searching for another way out. But the house felt like it was closing in, the walls narrowing, suffocating me. And then I heard it, a soft humming. The same voice, but now it was singing, like a lullaby. I turned toward the sound, and there she was. The woman. She was standing in the doorway of the next room, her eyes fixed on me, her lips curved into a faint, eerie smile. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice smooth and cold. "Not without her." I took a step back, shaking my head. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her smile never fading. "She belongs to me now. You should have listened." I didn't understand. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion. But I knew one thing. I had to get Rachel out of that car. I had to get both of us out of this nightmare. Without thinking, I rushed back to the car, yanking open the backseat door. Rachel's body was limp, but I pulled her out, lifting her into my arms. She was cold, so cold, but I wasn't giving up on her. I had to believe she was still in there somewhere. I had to believe I could save her. But as soon as I stepped away from the car, the house shifted. The walls creaked. The floor groaned beneath me. The air grew thick and oppressive, like I was being swallowed by the very space around me. And then the voices returned. They were louder this time, angrier. They swirled around me, filling the room with their cries and whispers, shouting over each other, telling me to leave, to stay, to give up, to run. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was like the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear, twisting my thoughts, controlling my every move. I held Rachel tighter, my legs trembling as I moved toward the door again. But the woman appeared in front of me, blocking my path. Her eyes were dark, bottomless pits, and her smile had faded into something far more sinister. "You can't take her," she said softly, her voice dripping with malice. "She's already gone." "No," I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "She's not. I can save her." But the woman shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "You were warned. The car is mine. And now, so is she." I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, rage replaced fear. I lunged at the woman, swinging my fist at her, but my hand passed right through her. She didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there, watching me struggle, a faint glimmer of amusement flickering in her dark eyes. "You can't fight what you don't understand," she whispered. I fell to my knees, Rachel still in my arms, tears streaming down my face. I didn't understand. I didn't understand any of this. But I knew I was losing her. The woman stepped closer, her cold presence pressing in on me like a shadow I couldn't escape. "Let her go," she said, her voice almost soothing now, like a mother comforting a child. "You don't belong here. Not anymore." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind was unraveling, torn between wanting to hold on to Rachel and the unbearable weight of the truth. The truth I had been avoiding since the moment we bought that cursed car. Rachel was gone. Slowly, I lowered her body to the ground, my hands shaking as I brushed her hair away from her face. Her skin was pale, lifeless, and no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, I knew she wasn't coming back. I stood up, my legs weak, my heart heavy. The woman stepped aside, allowing me to pass. The door was open now, the rain pouring outside, but I couldn't feel the relief I had hoped for. I couldn't feel anything but the crushing emptiness. As I stepped out of the house, I heard the car engine roar to life behind me. I turned around, and there it was, our car, headlights glowing, the engine purring as if it was waiting for me to get back in. But I knew better now. The woman's voice followed me out into the storm, her final words chilling me to the bone. "You can leave, but she stays. She'll always stay." I didn't look back. I couldn't. I walked into the rain, feeling the cold drops soak through my clothes, knowing that no matter how far I went, I'd never escape what had happened. The car would always be there, waiting. The voices would never stop. And Rachel would never leave that backseat. I had never been one to go rooting around in the attic. It wasn't my place, really. I had only lived in the house for a year, and I'd barely touched half the rooms on the second floor, let alone the musty, cobweb-ridden space above. But one rainy Saturday afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I'd been hearing strange sounds from up there for the last couple of weeks, like whispers, too faint to make out. At first, I thought it was just the old wood creaking, but it wasn't the usual groans of a house settling. This was different, almost human. The ladder leading up to the attic was stiff, and the door creaked open like something out of a horror movie. Dust filled the air as I climbed up, coughing as I made my way into the attic. The place was cluttered with old boxes, a few forgotten pieces of furniture, and odd scattered items left by the previous owner. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for until I saw it. A small, nondescript box in the corner, half hidden under a sheet. It wasn't big, just the size of a toaster, but it had strange symbols etched into its surface. It looked ancient, like something from another time. It had a few knobs and dials, like an old radio, but the thing that caught my eye was the speaker in the middle. I brushed off the dust and turned it over in my hands. There was no plug, no batteries, nothing. How was this supposed to work? Without thinking too much, I turned one of the dials. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, I heard it. Voices, faint at first, like they were coming from far away. "Did you hear about Mrs. Collins down the street?" The voice sounded familiar. I strained to listen, turning the dial just a little more. "Heard her husband's been sneaking around." My heart stopped. I knew that voice. It was my neighbor, Miss Havens, from across the street. But that was impossible. Miss Havens had passed away 3 months ago. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as the conversation continued. It wasn't just the voice that was familiar. I had heard this exact conversation before. Months ago. I was listening to the past. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some old radio. It was playing something that had already happened. I had heard that conversation last spring while trimming the hedge, not long before Miss Havens died. My hands were shaking as I fiddled with the dial again. twisting it just slightly. The voices grew louder, clearer. Can't believe she'd do that to him. I swallowed hard. That was my voice. I was talking to Gray, my neighbor. We were discussing some neighborhood gossip like we always did. But this was from last April. I wasn't imagining things. This device, it was letting me hear moments from the past. I should have put it down right then and there, but curiosity had a grip on me, stronger than common sense. I kept turning the dials, cycling through snippets of conversations. I heard neighbors arguing, children playing, whispered secrets in the dead of night. The voices came from all over, different times, different places, but always from the past. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to echoes of what had already been. Hours, maybe more. Time felt strange up in that attic, with only the device's faint static to keep me company. But I was hooked. I had to know more. Then I made a mistake. I turned the dial the other way. Instead of turning backward, I pushed it forward. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to hear something more recent, to see if this thing had limits. But when the static cleared, what I heard wasn't a conversation from the past anymore. It was something different. He's alone in the attic now. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but I understood every word. It wasn't from the past. It was happening right now. My eyes darted around the attic, but no one was there. The silence was suffocating. He's listening. He thinks he's alone. I stood up, dropping the device onto the floor. The voice continued, soft but insistent. He doesn't know what he's found, but they do. I bolted for the ladder, my foot catching on an old box, sending me crashing down the rickety steps. I hit the floor hard, but I didn't care. I scrambled up, slammed the attic door shut, and locked it. My chest heaved with every breath. Whoever, whatever, was talking. It knew I was there, knew I was listening. But what terrified me more was that I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the device, about what else it might be able to reveal. The following days were a blur. I tried to carry on like normal, go to work, talk to friends, pretend everything was fine. But the whispering stayed with me. I could still hear it, even when the device was locked away in the attic, especially at night. It was always at night. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back up there. I told myself I just wanted to see if the device had really worked. Maybe it was all some trick of my mind. Maybe I was just losing it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I needed to hear more. I had to know what came next. Back in the attic, I knelt before the device again, my hands trembling as I turned the dial forward this time. No hesitation. The static returned, then cleared. He's about to make a terrible mistake. The voice was back. It sounded closer now, more distinct, like it was standing just behind me. He doesn't understand the danger, but he will. I turned around sharply, but there was no one there. The attic was empty, just me, and that cursed box. But the air felt thick, heavy. Something was watching. I turned the dial again, faster now, desperate for answers. He thinks he's safe. The whispers were louder now, growing more intense. My heart raced. He isn't. Suddenly, the voices stopped, replaced by a low, static hum. I leaned closer, squinting at the device, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I heard it. A conversation. But this time, it wasn't about the past. It wasn't even about the present. It was my voice. "What do you want from me?" I heard myself say. The static crackled, and another voice, one I didn't recognize, answered. "We're already here." The attic door behind me slammed shut. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and I could feel a coldness creeping through the room, like something unseen had just entered. My hands shook as I reached for the dial, desperate to turn it off, but my fingers slipped. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't from the device. It was right next to me. "We've been waiting." I jerked around, but the attic was empty, still and silent, but that feeling, like something was watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I grabbed the device, yanked it from the floor, and sprinted down the ladder, slamming the attic door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The whispering never stopped. No matter how many blankets I pulled over my head, or how tightly I pressed my hands to my ears, the voices were there. Faint, but persistent. I should have thrown the device away, destroyed it, done anything but keep it. But I didn't. Instead, the next morning, I packed it into the trunk of my car and drove far, far out of town, to an old abandoned quarry I remembered from my childhood. I parked by the edge, staring down into the deep, dark water below. With a shaking hand, I pulled the device from the trunk. For a moment, I hesitated. Maybe if I threw it in, it would all end. The voices, the shadows, the thing in the attic. But then, just as I was about to let go, I heard it again. Don't. It was my voice. Not from the device, but inside my head. Whispering, warning me. I stood there, frozen, staring at the box. I should have thrown it in. I know that now. But instead, I turned around, got back into the car, and drove home. That was 2 months ago. The device sits in the attic now, untouched. I haven't gone back up there since. But it doesn't matter. The voices, they're still with me. I hear them everywhere. I go, whispering from the shadows, waiting, watching. And I know, deep down, that one day, I'll turn the dial again. Because they're not done with me yet. I'm not the superstitious type. Ghosts, curses, haunted houses, all that stuff seemed like fairy tales made to scare kids or thrill-seeking tourists. At least, that's what I thought until last year. Now, even telling this story feels like I'm reliving the nightmare all over again. But if I don't share what happened, maybe someone else will fall into the same trap. It started out innocent enough, just a weekend getaway. My wife, Emma, and I had been under a lot of stress at work, so we decided to take a break, a mini vacation. We found a quaint little hotel in a small town neither of us had heard of before. Its name doesn't matter because, after what happened, I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist on any map. We didn't book in advance. We just drove out there, wanting to feel spontaneous for once. Big mistake. The place looked charming from the outside, old-fashioned, but in a way that made it seem cozy. As we walked into the lobby, the scent of vanilla and pine filled the air. The receptionist, a woman with a friendly smile but oddly cold eyes, handed us the key to room 214. She didn't say much beyond that, but I remember her watching us as we headed to the elevator, like she was studying us. Room 214 was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway, the kind where the lights flickered every few seconds. I remember Emma making a joke about it being classic horror movie vibes, but we laughed it off. The room itself was normal. At first glance, anyway. A queen-size bed, a TV mounted on the wall, a small closet, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach. It wasn't until we started unpacking that Emma noticed something strange. She was pulling her suitcase from under the bed when she froze. "Jake, come look at this," she whispered, her voice tight with unease. I walked over to where she stood, and there it was. A note, yellowed with age, tucked just under the bed frame. It wasn't folded neatly. It was crumpled like someone had hurriedly shoved it there. Emma reached down and picked it up. The handwriting was shaky, written in thick, black ink. "Leave before midnight." That's all it said. No explanation. No signature. Some kind of prank. Emma asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the discomfort in her eyes. I wanted to agree with her, but something about that note didn't sit right with me. It was old, like it had been there for years, maybe even decades, but the message felt fresh, like it was meant for us. I laughed it off though, just to ease the tension. Probably some teenagers messing around. "Come on, we'll be out before midnight anyway. We've got dinner reservations, remember?" Emma nodded, but she kept glancing at the note. I could tell it bothered her more than she was letting on. We stuffed it in the trash and tried to forget about it, but that uneasy feeling hung in the air. After freshening up, we left for dinner, determined to enjoy our night. The restaurant was in town, just a few blocks from the hotel. As we ate, Emma brought up the note a few times, but we kept dismissing it. It was probably some local legend or a prank, we told ourselves. That's all. When we returned to the hotel later that night, it was quiet, unnervingly so. The receptionist was gone, and the lobby was empty. We made our way up to the room. As soon as we opened the door, I felt it. Something was off. The room felt colder than before, a kind of cold that sinks into your bones. The windows were shut, but there was a draft. Emma was the first to notice the note. It was back on the floor, right where we had found it before. My heart raced. I had thrown it away. I was sure of it. "Jake, how is it back?" Emma's voice wavered, her usual calm demeanor slipping. She reached for the note, and her hand trembled. I didn't have an answer. This wasn't a prank anymore. There was no way someone had snuck into our room without us noticing. I grabbed the note and threw it back into the trash. Slamming the lid shut like that would make a difference. "Let's just get some sleep. We'll leave in the morning," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Emma agreed, but neither of us slept much. Every little noise, every creak, every rustle kept us on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft but deliberate. I got up, peered through the peephole, but no one was there. Midnight was approaching. The clock on the nightstand glowed red in the darkness. 11:47 p.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. The room felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening. Then there was a knock at the door. The knock echoed through the room, so soft at first that I thought I had imagined it. I glanced over at Emma, her eyes wide with fear. She had heard it too. My heart raced, my mind scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone from the hotel, maybe another guest. Anything to keep myself calm. I got up and approached the door slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. My palm was sweaty, and as I gripped the cold metal, the knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to steady my voice. There was no response. I pressed my eye to the peephole, squinting into the hallway. It was empty, just the flickering lights casting eerie shadows along the walls. I stood there for what felt like minutes, waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened. "It's nobody," I said, turning back to Emma. "It's just a prank," like I said. But Emma wasn't listening. She was staring at the window now, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. The window, which had been shut and locked when we left, was now wide open. A gust of cold wind blew the curtains into the room, sending a chill down my spine. But it wasn't just the open window that had my stomach churning with dread. It was the reflection in the glass. Standing there, behind us in the mirror-like surface, was a figure, a dark silhouette, almost human in shape but distorted, like it didn't quite belong. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, bony fingers stretching out towards us. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, just a void where eyes and a mouth should be. I froze. The blood drained from my face as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I felt a scream building in my throat, but it was stuck there, trapped by the paralyzing fear that gripped me. Then the lights flickered, plunging the room into complete darkness. For a second, everything was silent. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could hear Emma's ragged breathing beside me. I reached out blindly, grabbing her hand, and pulled her close. We stood there, frozen, waiting for the lights to come back on. When they did, the figure was gone, but the note, it was back. This time, it wasn't under the bed. It was on the nightstand, right next to the clock that now read 11:58 p.m. The message had changed. You won't make it. My mouth went dry, and Emma gasped as she read it. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to question it anymore. All I knew was that we had to leave. I grabbed our bags, yanking open the door and pulling Emma out into the hallway. The flickering lights above cast shadows that danced along the walls, making everything feel twisted and wrong. We rushed toward the elevator, my heart racing as I hit the button repeatedly. But the elevator didn't come. It stayed on the first floor, unmoving, like it was mocking us. The air grew colder, and the hallway seemed to stretch longer, darker, like we were running in place. We can't wait, I said, dragging Emma toward the stairs. Every instinct in my body screamed that we were running out of time. The stairs seemed endless, each step echoing loudly in the empty hotel. As we descended, I heard it again, the soft knock, now coming from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere. It followed us, growing louder and faster, until it was no longer a knock, but a pounding, a relentless thumping that matched the beat of my heart. We burst through the door at the bottom of the stairs, into the lobby, but it was empty. No receptionist, no guests, nothing. Just silence. The clock behind the front desk read 11:59. I pushed open the front door, and the cold night air hit us like a wall. We stumbled outside, gasping for breath. But as we reached the parking lot, I stopped dead in my tracks. Our car was gone. Not stolen. Gone. As if it had never been there in the first place. The street was empty, just like the lobby, just like the hallway, just like everything around us. My pulse quickened, panic rising in my chest. Emma pulled at my arm, but I was frozen again, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." I nodded, but where could we go? There was no car, no other buildings, nothing but the endless stretch of road leading into darkness. And then, as I looked back at the hotel, I saw it again. The figure, standing in the doorway, watching us. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Because I knew, somehow, that it had already won. The clock tower in the distance struck midnight. The first chime echoed through the air, deep and ominous, and with each strike, the figure stepped forward. By the final chime, it was standing right in front of us. I don't remember what happened next. Everything went black, like I had been swallowed by the darkness itself. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and we were back in the hotel room, lying in bed as if nothing had happened. But Emma was gone. Not just missing, gone. No trace of her, not even a wrinkle in the sheets where she had slept. The note was gone too, and the window was shut, locked tight like it had always been. I checked out of that hotel alone. The receptionist didn't ask where Emma was. She didn't say anything at all, just handed me my bill with that same cold, unreadable smile. I tried going to the police, but they didn't believe me. There were no records of Emma ever checking into the hotel. No records of that hotel even existing. I've tried to forget what happened, but I can't. I see her sometimes, in reflections, in the corners of my vision. But when I turn to look, she's never really there. And every night, at exactly midnight, I hear the knock. I've been repairing shoes for over 30 years. In that time, I've seen everything, from cheap knockoffs to handcrafted masterpieces. Some people came in every other year to get their shoes resoled, while others came in more often, depending on how hard they walked through life. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the strange pair of shoes that crossed my counter. The first time I noticed something off was about a year ago. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and a weary face came in carrying a pair of black leather shoes. Nothing unusual about them at first glance. They were scuffed, the sole nearly worn through, and the heels crooked. "Can you fix these?" he asked, placing them gently on the counter, as though he was afraid they might fall apart if he handled them any harder. "Of course," I replied. "Give me a week, and I'll have them ready for you." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, paid in advance, and left. I didn't think much of him until the following week when he came to pick them up. As usual, I'd done a decent job. New soles, polished the leather until it gleamed, and straightened out the heels. The shoes looked brand new. Perfect, he said quietly, taking them back with the same careful touch. That should have been the end of it, just another customer passing through. But it wasn't. 2 weeks later, the same man returned, holding the same pair of shoes. Only this time, they didn't look new. In fact, they looked worse than before. The sole was worn out again, and deep scratches marred the leather as if they'd been dragged through gravel for miles. Did something happen to these? I asked, frowning as I inspected the damage. He shook his head, his expression blank. No, they just wear out fast. I nodded, though unease crawled down my spine. I'd seen well-worn shoes in my time, but nothing that deteriorated so quickly. Nevertheless, I agreed to fix them again, and the man left without further conversation. I repaired the shoes, though this time I paid extra attention to the condition of the materials. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I dismissed it as an overactive imagination. The man returned, paid without complaint, and took the shoes with him. A month passed before he came back again, and this time I was genuinely disturbed. The shoes looked as if they had been through hell. The soles were completely shredded, the leather was cracked, and there were even faint, dark stains along the sides. I couldn't tell if it was mud or something else. "You're walking a lot," I said with a half-hearted laugh, hoping to lighten the mood. He didn't smile. In fact, he looked worse than before, gaunt, almost hollow. Just fix them. I couldn't ignore the strangeness anymore. Something about the shoes, or maybe the man, felt wrong. It wasn't just the rapid deterioration. There was an air of something sinister clinging to them, something I couldn't quite place, but could feel crawling under my skin every time I touched them. For a while, I thought about refusing service the next time he came in. But something inside me, a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable fear, kept me from doing so. I wanted to know what was going on. Why did these shoes wear out so quickly? What was this man doing with them? The next time he came in, I asked him outright, "What's going on with these shoes? This isn't normal." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes shadowed, as though he was weighing his response. Finally, he spoke. "They aren't mine." That took me aback. "What do you mean?" "They belong to someone else, someone I lost." His voice was low, almost a whisper, and I had to lean in to hear him. "I wear them because I feel close to her." It made sense, in a twisted kind of way. People hold on to things after someone dies, a piece of clothing, a favorite book, even shoes. But it didn't explain why the shoes were in such terrible shape. Before I could ask more, he added, "They don't like being worn by anyone else." I didn't sleep that night. His words echoed in my mind, and the thought of those shoes, the way they seemed to degrade with unnatural speed, gnawed at me. Was it just a trick of the mind, or was there really something wrong with them? The following week, the man didn't come back. Then another week passed, and I didn't see him. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had been happening with those shoes had ended. But then, late one evening, just as I was about to close up, the bell above the door chimed. It was him. He looked worse than I had ever seen him, pale, almost skeletal, his clothes hanging off his frame like he hadn't eaten in days. In his hands, he held the shoes. They were in the worst condition yet, barely recognizable as the same pair I'd repaired over and over. "They want you to take them," he whispered, holding the shoes out toward me. I didn't want to touch them, but something compelled me to. As soon as my fingers brushed the worn leather, I felt a jolt, a sharp electric shock that ran up my arm and into my chest. I don't know what possessed me to take them, but I did. The man thanked me quietly, his voice barely audible, and left the shop without looking back. That night, I dreamt of the shoes. In my dream, I saw a woman wearing them, walking down a long, dark road. Each step she took seemed to wear the shoes down further, until the soles were nothing but shreds, and the leather peeled away from her feet. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and a sick feeling in my gut. The shoes were still in my shop, sitting on the counter where I'd left them. But now, they seemed different. The air around them felt heavy, oppressive, as though the shoes themselves were watching me. I tried to ignore them, to go about my day as usual, but it was impossible. The shoes were all I could think about. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That night, I took the shoes home with me. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could figure out what was wrong with them if I had them closer. But the moment I crossed the threshold of my house, I knew I'd made a mistake. Strange things started happening. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway when I was alone, and at night, I'd wake to the sound of someone whispering just outside my door. The shoes remained where I'd left them, but I could feel their presence everywhere. On the third night, I dreamt of the woman again. This time, she wasn't walking. She was standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me with hollow eyes, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. When I woke, the shoes were gone. I searched the house, but there was no sign of them. Yet I could still feel them, like they were hiding, waiting for me to find them. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't tell if it was in my head or real. Then, one evening, as I was locking up the shop, I saw him again. The man who had brought me the shoes. Only now, he wasn't the same. He looked like a ghost of himself, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. "They're yours now," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "They've chosen you." I never saw him again after that. But the shoes, oh, the shoes, they're still with me. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can hear them. The soft scrape of leather against wood. The faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth outside my door. I tried to get rid of them once, threw them into the river, thinking that would be the end of it. But the next morning, they were back, sitting neatly on my doorstep, as if they'd never left. I don't know what they want from me, but I do know one thing. Those shoes are cursed, and they won't stop until they've claimed their next victim. I always knew I had a knack for design. It started when I was a kid, sketching dresses and jackets in the margins of my school books. Over time, those simple doodles turned into a full-blown career. By the time I hit my late 20s, I had my own studio, a decent clientele, and enough creativity to keep me going for years. Or so I thought. It all started with a sketch I made one night, around midnight. I was alone in my studio, as usual. The soft hum of the city buzzed in the background, but inside it was just me, the dim light of my desk lamp, and the blank sheet of paper waiting for inspiration. I hadn't been able to come up with anything new for weeks, and the pressure was starting to build. My hand moved across the paper almost on its own, shaping lines, curves, and folds into a sleek dress with intricate lace details. It felt different, like I wasn't the one in control. The next morning, I showed the sketch to my assistant, Maria. She was impressed, but there was something off about her reaction. Her smile faded for a second, and her brows furrowed. "That looks familiar," she said, her voice quiet. "I swear I've seen that design before." I laughed it off, brushing her comment aside. Maybe it's a trend coming back, but something about her words lingered in my mind. That night, I went online, looking through vintage fashion archives, old photographs, anything that might give me a clue. Hours passed before I found it. A black and white photograph from the 1920s, a woman standing at a grand party, wearing a dress almost identical to my sketch. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't just similar, it was an exact match. The caption beneath the photo made my blood run cold. "Woman in her final appearance before tragic death later that evening." The room suddenly felt too quiet, the hum of the city fading into the background as the realization sank in. This was no coincidence. I stared at the photo, then at my sketch, flipping between the two as if somehow Doing that would make the similarities disappear. But they didn't. They only became clearer. I closed my laptop, shoved the sketch under a pile of papers, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just one of those strange moments when your brain plays tricks on you. Maybe I'd seen that photo somewhere before and subconsciously recreated the design. That had to be it. The following days were uneventful, and I was able to push the strange coincidence out of my mind. I focused on my other projects, trying to ignore the eerie feeling that had crept into my studio. But it wasn't long before I found myself sketching late at night again, lost in that same familiar trance. This time, it was a coat, long with sharp labels and a pattern I couldn't quite place. My hand moved with a confidence that didn't feel like mine, as if someone else was guiding the pencil. The next morning, I laid the sketch on my desk, looking at it with a mix of pride and unease. It was a beautiful design, no doubt, but that unsettling sense of déjà vu was back. I decided to show Maria again, despite her reaction the last time. "Look at this one," I said casually, handing her the sketch. She hesitated before taking it, her eyes scanning the paper. The color drained from her face. "No, no way," she whispered. "I've seen this before." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where?" She pulled out her phone and quickly typed something into a search engine. After a few moments, she found what she was looking for and handed the phone to me. On the screen was an old photograph of a man standing on a rainy street corner, wearing the exact same coat I had sketched. The caption was simple: "Victim of unsolved murder, 1974. I dropped the phone, my fingers trembling. This was impossible. I had never seen that photo, never even heard of this man. But there it was, another design of mine perfectly matching something from the past, something tied to death. "Are you okay?" Maria asked, her voice distant, like I was hearing it from underwater. I nodded, but I wasn't okay. I felt like the walls of my studio were closing in on me, the air thick and stifling. I needed to get out of there, away from the sketches, away from the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. 2 designs, both matching photos of people who had died wearing the same styles. My logical side tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some bizarre coincidence, or maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next day, I decided I wouldn't sketch. I couldn't risk it. But as the hours dragged on, the compulsion grew stronger. It was like something inside me was pulling me to the drawing board, whispering that I needed to create. By the time the sun had set, I was sitting at my desk, pencil in hand, sketching without even realizing it. This time, it was a gown, elegant with flowing silk and delicate embroidery. The details were so intricate, so vivid in my mind. It was like I had seen the dress 100 times before. I finished the sketch and sat back, exhausted but somehow satisfied. That feeling didn't last long. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Maria. She had found another photograph. This one was from the 1950s, a famous socialite at her final party, before she was found dead in her home the next day. She was wearing the gown I had sketched. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of dread, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't control. Why was this happening? How was it even possible? I didn't go into the studio that day. Instead, I spent hours combing through more archives, more old photos, and every time I found the same thing. My designs weren't just coincidences. They were exact replicas of what these people had worn, down to the smallest detail. And every single one of them had died under mysterious or violent circumstances. I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, and I didn't know how to escape. Every time I picked up a pencil, every time I let my creativity flow, it was like I was channeling something dark, something tied to the dead. Days turned into weeks, and I stopped sketching altogether. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't be responsible for whatever was happening, but the urge to create, to design, never left. It gnawed at me, tugging at the edges of my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. One night, unable to resist any longer, I gave in. I sat down at my desk, shaking as I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. My hand moved on its own, sketching a dress that seemed to materialize from some forgotten part of my mind. I finished it in minutes, faster than I'd ever worked before. But this time, I didn't need Maria to find a photograph. As soon as I looked at the completed sketch, I knew. I didn't just recognize the design. I recognized the face that would be wearing it. It was me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My own face stared back at me from the sketch, a perfect likeness in every detail. The dress was something I had never even imagined for myself. A long, flowing gown with sharp, elegant cuts that exuded an aura of finality. It wasn't just another design. It was a shroud. I slammed the sketchbook shut and threw it across the room. My heart pounded in my chest as a wave of cold fear washed over me. I stumbled out of my chair, my legs weak beneath me, and backed away from the desk as if it were alive, haunted. There was no way I had sketched that of my own will. Someone, or something, was controlling me. I couldn't stay in the studio anymore. It had become a tomb filled with ghosts of the past, ghosts I had unknowingly channeled through my designs. I grabbed my coat and left, not caring about locking the door, not caring about anything except putting distance between me and the nightmare I had unleashed. Outside, the city lights blurred into a haze as I rushed down the street, unsure of where I was going. I had to talk to someone, anyone, to make sense of this. Maria. No, she was already spooked by the previous sketches. She couldn't help. I needed answers, and there was only one place I thought of: the archives. It was late, but the city's public library stayed open until midnight. I made my way there, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. How could my sketches match dead people's clothing so precisely? How could I have drawn my own face in that gown? Was I next? I reached the library and hurried inside, heading straight for the archive section. I needed to know more about the people in those old photos. I had to find a connection, something that could explain why this was happening. Hours passed as I sifted through endless records, articles, and obituaries. Each victim had died in strange, unsolved circumstances, just like the captions had said. But the strangest part was how they were all connected. They had all worked in the fashion industry, either as designers, models, or stylists. And now, I was one of them. My hands trembled as I stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping from the 1940s. It detailed the mysterious disappearance of a famous fashion designer, Elise Millard, who had vanished shortly after her sketches began mimicking the deaths of others in the industry. The article claimed she had been last seen at her studio, surrounded by sketches of dresses that no one else had ever seen. Dresses that matched the clothing of people who had died weeks later. I sat back, my mind reeling. This wasn't just happening to me. It had happened before. The same curse, or whatever this was, had plagued the designers for decades. And now it had found me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. I pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a message from an unknown number. My stomach lurched as I opened it. "It's almost time. The dress is ready. Will you wear it?" I dropped the phone, my entire body trembling. The sketch, the dress. It wasn't just a drawing. It was real. And whoever, or whatever, had been guiding my hand was coming for me. I had to get out of there. I bolted out of the library and ran into the cold night air, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go home. I couldn't go anywhere familiar. I needed to hide. But as I ran, the city streets felt different. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, like hands reaching out. I stumbled to a stop, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around me had grown unnaturally still. No cars, no people, just silence. Then, I saw it. Standing in the middle of the street was a figure, dressed in the gown from my sketch. I couldn't see its face, but I knew. I knew it was me, or some twisted version of me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, gliding across the ground as if it were weightless, its eyes locked onto mine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, it spoke, its voice a low, echoing whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You can't escape. It's your turn." Before I could react, the figure was gone, dissolving into the night like smoke. But the words it left behind hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I rushed back to my apartment, desperate to make sense of what had just happened. But when I opened the door, I froze. There, lying on my bed, was the gown. The same one from the sketch, from the street. The fabric shimmered in the dim light, draped across the sheets like it had always been there, waiting for me. I backed away, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The air grew thick, and the room darkened until only the gown remained in the spotlight. There was no way out, no escape. Trembling, I stepped closer to the bed, my hands reaching for the fabric as if I were in a trance. I could feel the cold, silken threads slipping through my fingers, binding me to something I couldn't see but knew was there. I slipped into the gown, and the moment it touched my skin, I knew it was over. My reflection in the mirror stared back at me, lifeless and hollow. The gown fit perfectly, like it had been made for me all along. As I stood there, trapped in the dress, I realized the truth. I wasn't the designer. I was just the next in line. The room began to spin, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was my reflection smiling back at me. No longer mine, but something else. Something that had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. I've been an editor at New Horizon magazine for almost a decade now, and I thought I'd seen everything that could land in my inbox. From wild fantasy stories to heartwarming memoirs, there was little that surprised me. But that all changed last Monday. It was a normal morning. I sipped my coffee and opened my email, ready to sort through the latest round of submissions. Most were the usual, good enough for a glance, some worth saving for a second read, and others, well, let's just say they ended up in the trash folder faster than I could blink. But one submission stood out. The title read, "This Week's Events, a Prediction." It sounded like some quirky attempt at fiction, or maybe a humorous take on daily life. Curious, I clicked it open. The story started simple enough, someone writing in a diary about random events. The first entry was dated for Monday, the very day I was reading it. It described a mild earthquake shaking the city in the early afternoon. I smiled. Earthquakes were rare here, but it wasn't impossible. Still, it was just fiction, right? The next entry was about a fire breaking out at a local coffee shop on Tuesday. Then, a sudden rise in accidents on the highway by Wednesday, followed by a strange power outage across several neighborhoods on Thursday. I almost dismissed it until I read the final entry. It detailed something chilling. On Friday, a man named Jonah will go missing. He will be found by his co-workers the following Monday, unresponsive, in his office. The words, "It's watching," will be written across the walls in his own handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. Jonah was my name. I stared at the screen for a while, letting the words sink in. My name, Jonah, wasn't exactly uncommon, but seeing it there, paired with such a disturbing prediction, sent a shiver down my spine. The rational side of me knew it had to be a coincidence, but something gnawed at the back of my mind, an unsettling sense of dread. By noon, I had pushed the story out of my head. I had deadlines to meet, and I wasn't going to let some weird submission distract me. It wasn't until later that day, around 2 p.m., that the building began to shake. At first, it was a light tremor, something you might mistake for construction work happening a few blocks away. But then it grew stronger. My mug rattled on the desk, and the lights flickered. People in the office started murmuring nervously, some standing up to brace themselves as the floor beneath us trembled. An earthquake. It lasted only about 20 seconds, but it was enough to stir panic. When it stopped, everyone in the office looked at each other wide-eyed. Earthquakes were rare here. Very rare. That gnawing feeling returned. I tried to shake it off. Earthquakes happen, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. I opened the email again, scrolling back to the first entry of the story. The date, the time, everything matched. No, it had to be a fluke. Maybe the author had heard something on the news about potential seismic activity, and it was just a lucky guess. That had to be it, right? I closed the email again, trying to focus on my work. But all I could think about was the next event, a fire at a local coffee shop. I found myself avoiding my usual coffee run the next morning, as though staying away would somehow prevent it from happening. Instead, I checked the news obsessively. By the time I opened the live news feed around 10 a.m., there it was. Local coffee shop catches fire. No casualties reported. The article had a picture of the place. I knew it well. I had been there dozens of times before, meeting freelance writers, or grabbing a quick drink between edits. And now it was up in flames, just like the story had said. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was all some twisted prank, but how? There was no logical way this submission could predict events like this. I could feel the fear settling in. A low hum in the back of my mind that only grew louder with each passing minute. The next day, Wednesday, was even worse. Accidents flooded the highway. The radio hosts talked about it nonstop. One pile-up after another, as though the roads themselves were cursed. My commute home took twice as long, and as I crawled through the traffic, I couldn't help but think about what the story had said. By the time Thursday rolled around, I was terrified to open my email. I didn't want to see what came next, but at the same time, I couldn't stay away. That's the thing about fear. It draws you in even when you know you should walk away. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, the power in my apartment flickered out. I sat in the dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of my laptop screen. There it was, the email still sitting in my inbox, mocking me. The lights stayed out for almost an hour, and when they came back, my hands were trembling. Friday was coming. The final entry of the story haunted me. On Friday, a man named Jonah will go missing. He will be found by his co-workers the following Monday, unresponsive, in his office. The words, "It's watching," will be written across the walls in his own handwriting. I considered not going into work. Maybe if I stayed home, I could break the chain of events, stop whatever this was from happening. But by then, I wasn't sure if anything could stop it. Friday came, and I forced myself into the office, determined to prove this was all in my head. The day started like any other, people chatting by the coffee machine, the hum of keyboards filling the air, but something felt off. The atmosphere was heavy, like the calm before a storm. By noon, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every noise made me jump, and my colleagues began to notice. "You okay, Jonah?" one of them asked. I just nodded, forcing a weak smile, but I wasn't okay. Not by a long shot. I spent most of the day staring at my office walls, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The hours ticked by, and by the time 5 p.m. rolled around, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the story was wrong after all. I packed up my things, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. That's when I saw it. On the wall, right by the door, scrawled in thick, black letters, "It's watching." I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my vision blurred. The letters weren't there that morning. I was sure of it. I staggered backward, heart pounding as my mind raced. This couldn't be happening. I had to be imagining it. But the letters were real. They were there. And worse, they were in my handwriting. I don't remember much after that. Someone found me the next Monday, just like the story said, unresponsive, staring at the words on the wall. My mind shattered. They told me later that I had written the words over and over. My fingers were covered in ink, and my eyes, bloodshot from staring too long, looked hollow. I haven't gone back to the office since. I don't think I ever will. I've tried to forget that email, tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just some twisted coincidence. But deep down, I know the truth. Some stories aren't fiction. Some things shouldn't be read. And whatever it was that sent that submission, it's still watching. Weeks have passed since that day, but the memory remains as vivid as if it happened just yesterday. They discharged me from the hospital after a few days of observation, though I don't think they had any real idea what was wrong with me. They chalked it up to a stress-induced breakdown, which was convenient, easy to explain away the madness with a clinical label. But I knew better. It wasn't stress. I quit my job at the magazine. I didn't even bother with the usual formalities. I just sent in a resignation email and shut down my laptop. I couldn't face that place again. I couldn't bear the thought of stepping foot into that office, with those words still etched into the walls, haunting me. I spent the next few days holed up in my apartment, trying to figure out what to do. The email that started it all was still there, sitting in my inbox like a ticking time bomb. I didn't want to open it again, but I couldn't bring myself to delete it either. I was trapped, torn between curiosity and terror. Eventually, I made a decision. I needed to know who sent that story. Maybe if I could track down the author, I'd get some answers. Find out if this was all some sick prank or something far worse. So I did what any desperate person would do. I started digging. I combed through every piece of information I could find about the submission. The email address was anonymous, the IP address traced back to a random location overseas. No name, no contact information, no sign of a real person behind it. The more I searched, the more I realized how futile it all was. Whoever, or whatever, had sent that story didn't want to be found. And then, a new email arrived. It was from the same address. My heart raced as I opened it, hands trembling. The subject line read, "Next week's events." I almost didn't want to read it. I knew what it would contain, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't help myself. I clicked on the message. The story started much like the last one, except this time, it was worse. More detailed, more personal. It began with Sunday. A man named Jonah will stay in his apartment, ignoring the outside world. He will receive another email and open it, despite knowing what it will bring. I felt sick. The story was describing me in real time. The next entries were a blur of horror. By Wednesday, the events took a darker turn. Jonah will hear strange noises coming from his apartment walls, whispers that grow louder each night. He will try to ignore them, but they will follow him wherever he goes. Thursday's entry chilled me to the bone. Jonah will wake up to find his bedroom door open, though he locked it before going to bed. The words, "It's watching," will be carved into his bedside table. And then, the final entry for Friday, Jonah will disappear. No one will find him, but the story will continue. I shut my laptop and backed away from the desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt smaller, the air suffocating. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to flee, to leave the apartment, and never come back. But where would I go? This thing, whatever it was, had already found me. I couldn't escape it. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible, a soft murmur that could have been the wind. But as the hours passed, they grew louder. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block them out, but it didn't work. The voices seeped through, like water finding its way through cracks. By the third night, the whispers had become unbearable. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were inside my head, crawling through my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. All I could do was listen. And then, just as the story had predicted, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. The words, "It's watching," were carved into the wood of my bedside table, the grooves fresh and deep. I should have run. I should have called someone, anyone, but it was too late. Whatever had sent that email had already claimed me. Friday came, and just as the story had said, I disappeared. I don't know where I am now. It's dark here and cold. The whispers never stop. I can feel them around me, pressing in, watching. I've tried to leave, but every door leads me back to the same place. The same room, the same darkness. I'm trapped in the story now. And the worst part, I know someone else is reading this. Maybe it's you. Maybe you've just received an email too. Be careful what you open, because it's watching. I've been a pizza delivery driver for about 3 years now, and it's safe to say I've seen some weird stuff. You'd think pizza delivery would be simple. Drive, hand over the pizza, collect the money, done. But I've had my fair share of late-night deliveries to sketchy houses, strange people answering the door in costumes, and even the occasional creepy phone call. None of that compares to what happened last month. It started on a Monday night, just as the clock hit 11 p.m. The place I work for is a small pizza joint, Tony's Pizza, and business usually dies down by then. But as I was preparing to close, an order came in. The address, 408 Linden Drive. I knew the area pretty well, and something about the address struck me as odd, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I made the pizza, hopped in my car, and headed out. It wasn't until I got close to the destination that I remembered why the address seemed off. 408 Linden Drive didn't exist anymore. The house had burned down years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, if I remember right. It had been abandoned ever since, left in ruins after the fire. There wasn't much left except the charred remains of what used to be a 2-story house. Yet the order had been placed, and it had been prepaid online, so I figured I'd at least check it out. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe someone was rebuilding and just hadn't updated the location online. When I got there though, the place looked the same as it had for years. Nothing but an empty lot and the remains of the burned down house. I parked at the curb, double-checked the address on my phone, and sure enough, it matched. Nobody was around. The street was dead silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I sat there for a minute, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to just drive off, but another part of me was curious. Maybe someone was squatting there or playing a prank on me. I stepped out of the car, pizza box in hand, and walked toward the lot. The air felt colder, like a chill had settled in, even though it was late spring. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling pretty dumb, when suddenly my phone buzzed. A text. It was from the number listed with the order. "Leave the pizza on the porch." I froze. What porch? There was no porch. The house was gone. My heart started racing, but I didn't want to lose my cool. Maybe this was some elaborate joke. I replied back, asking who it was, and if they were messing with me, but no answer came. After standing there for what felt like forever, I set the pizza box on the ground, near where the front door would have been, and hurried back to my car. I drove off as fast as I could, eager to get away from that place. The next night, at exactly 11 p.m., another order came in. 408 Linden Drive again. I thought it was a mistake, but it wasn't. The same pizza, the same message, prepaid, with instructions to leave it on the porch. I didn't want to go back, but curiosity got the better of me. This time, when I pulled up, the air felt even colder than before, almost unnaturally so. I didn't wait long. I placed the pizza on the ground and got out of there fast, not bothering to call out or text. By the third night, I was really starting to freak out. Same time, same order. It was like clockwork. I tried telling my boss, but he brushed it off. "It's paid for. Who cares where it goes?" he said, completely unfazed. That night, though, something changed. When I got to the lot, I noticed something different. There were footprints in the dirt, small ones, like they belonged to a child. But no one had been there when I left the pizzas before. No one could have been, right? I stood there, staring at the prints, feeling my skin crawl. Before I could turn back, my phone buzzed again. "Come inside. We're waiting." My heart felt like it stopped. I knew for a fact there was no inside. There was no house, but I couldn't stop myself from looking around. That's when I saw it. The house, fully intact, standing there as if it had never burned down. 2 stories, with a porch, lit up by dim, flickering lights. The sight of it made my head spin. I blinked, and it was gone. Just the empty lot again. I backed away slowly, feeling like I was losing my mind. I don't know what I was expecting, but nothing about this felt right. I left the pizza and sped off without looking back. It didn't stop there. Every night, at 11 p.m. sharp, the order would come in. By the end of the week, I was starting to see things. Glimpses of figures in the lot. Shadows moving where there should have been none. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The final night was the worst. I pulled up, the cold air heavier than ever, like it was wrapping around me, suffocating me. This time, I saw them. Shadows standing in the lot, watching me. They didn't move, didn't say a word, just stared. My phone buzzed again. Join us inside. I didn't want to look, but I did. The house was there again, as clear as day, glowing under the moonlight. The front door was open, beckoning. I could hear faint voices, almost like whispers, calling me in. I should have driven away. I should have ignored the buzzing in my pocket. But I didn't. Against every instinct, I walked toward the house, stepping through the front door into a darkness so thick it felt like I was drowning. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were deafening. Then I saw them. The family who had lived there before the fire. Their eyes hollow, their skin charred and cracked. They reached for me, pulling me in deeper, their cold hands gripping tighter and tighter. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed me whole. I never delivered another pizza. Now, every night at 11 p.m., I sit at 408 Linden Drive, waiting for the next delivery driver to bring the pizza, waiting for someone to join us. Because once you've been inside, you never leave. I never left that house. I don't even know if I exist outside of it anymore. It's hard to explain, but time doesn't work the same way here. Every night feels like the first. It always starts with the delivery, another driver, just like I was, pulling up to the lot with a pizza in hand, confused, scared. They never see me. Not at first. I'm part of the shadows now, waiting with the others. We stand there, watching them, hoping one of them will make it out. But none of them ever do. They all fall into the same trap, the same twisted cycle that I did. And just like me, they walk toward the house. The family, the ones who were burned in the fire, they're here too. They're always here. I don't know why they want us, or why they keep calling us back. Maybe they're trapped, just like we are. Maybe they need more souls to keep the house standing, to keep this place alive. It doesn't matter. No one can leave. Once you enter, you become part of the house. I can't feel the passing of days anymore, but I can remember that final delivery, the moment I crossed over, the moment I lost everything. Now, I wait in silence, unable to warn anyone who follows. I try to scream, try to reach out to the drivers who come, but no one ever hears me. They all do the same thing. They all follow the same path. They step through that door, and they never come out. The other night, though, something changed. For the first time, I heard someone on the other side. Another driver, a girl, stood outside the lot, staring at the house. She looked terrified, her hands shaking as she held the pizza box. I thought, maybe, just maybe, she'd be the one to break the cycle. She didn't move, though. She just stood there, looking right at me, like she could see me standing in the shadows. And for the first time in what felt like forever, someone spoke to me. "Are you trapped too?" she whispered. I wanted to answer, but I couldn't. My voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She looked around like she was searching for a way out, but there isn't one. There never was. Her phone buzzed. I knew what the message said. I could feel it. "Come inside. We're waiting." I wanted to tell her to run, to throw the pizza down and drive away, but she didn't. She did exactly what we all do. She placed the pizza on the ground, backed up, and hesitated, just for a second. I saw it in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, but like me, she couldn't resist the pull of that house. The door creaked open, as it always does, and the shadows grew darker, thicker, wrapping around her. She stepped forward, drawn in, just like I had been. I watched helplessly as she crossed the threshold, disappearing into the black void. And now, I wait again. Another night, another delivery, another driver who will be lost forever. The house always wins. No one ever leaves. I don't know how long I've been here, but I do know this. If you ever get an order for 408 Linden Drive, don't go. Don't be like me. Don't be like the others. Turn around. Drive away. Because once you step inside that house, there's no going back. And I'll be there, waiting for you, just like I'm waiting for the next delivery. Being a phone operator is usually pretty uneventful. It's just answering calls, connecting people, and making sure the lines stay running. I've been doing this job for years, and I've seen all sorts of strange calls. Wrong numbers, prank calls, you name it. But none of those could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was around 11 p.m., and my shift was almost over. I was staring blankly at my screen, waiting for the last few calls to trickle in, when the phone on my desk rang. I glanced at the screen, and that's when I saw it. The number looked strange, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was impossible. The number on the screen had been disconnected decades ago. I knew this because I'd heard the stories. This particular number used to belong to an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The people who lived there were killed in a fire back in the 80s, and the house had been abandoned ever since. The phone line was shut off after the incident, and no one had lived there since. For a moment, I thought it was some sort of prank, but something about it felt different. I hesitated but picked up the call. "Hello," I said, my voice steady, but my stomach was churning. There was a long pause on the other end, a silence so heavy it made my skin crawl. Then, finally, a voice crackled through the line. "They're coming for me." My heart skipped a beat. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, like someone speaking from a great distance. It sounded desperate. I leaned closer to the receiver. "Who's coming? Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. But there was no answer. Just static. I held the phone, waiting, but all I could hear was the crackling sound of interference. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the line went dead. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the phone, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was some sort of glitch, a crossed line or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice had been real, too real. I checked the call log, and sure enough, the number was there. The number of the old farmhouse, the one that had been disconnected for over 30 years. I double-checked the records, and everything confirmed what I already knew. That phone line was dead. So how had it called me? I spent the rest of my shift trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just a malfunction, I told myself. Maybe the system had picked up an old signal or something. But even as I tried to reason it away, I couldn't help but feel like something was terribly wrong. The next day, I couldn't get the call out of my head. It nagged at me, like a splinter stuck deep under my skin. So, I did what any rational person would do. I decided to investigate. I dug up some old records, pulled up anything I could find about the farmhouse. The more I read, the more unsettling it became. The fire that killed the family wasn't an accident. According to the reports, the fire started in the middle of the night, and the family had been trapped inside. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. The house had burned to the ground, with the family still inside. The phone call I had received, it was from that house. But there was no way anyone could have made that call. The phone line had been cut off, the house abandoned. And yet, I had heard that voice. They're coming for me. Who was coming? And why now, after all these years? I don't know what made me do it. But a few nights later, I found myself driving out to the old farmhouse. It was a crumbling ruin, barely standing, surrounded by overgrown weeds and twisted trees. The air around the place felt heavy, like the weight of all the tragedy that had happened there still lingered. I parked the car and got out, the wind whispering through the tall grass. As I approached the house, a shiver ran down my spine. It felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to get closer. The front door hung off its hinges, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was a mess. Charred remains of furniture, debris scattered everywhere. But there, in the corner of the room, was something that made my blood run cold. A phone. An old rotary phone, covered in dust, sat on a small table. It didn't belong there. It shouldn't have been there. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel something dark and angry, lurking just beyond my sight. And then, before I could stop myself, I picked up the receiver. The static returned, loud and angry, filling my ears. And then the voice came through again. "They're here." It was the same voice, but this time, it was clearer, more urgent. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking. I wanted to drop the phone to run, but I was frozen in place. "They never left," the voice whispered. "They're still here." Suddenly, the air around me grew cold, and the lights flickered. I looked around the room, my breath coming in short gasps. Shadows moved in the corners, twisting and writhing like something alive. I slammed the receiver down and stumbled back, my heart racing. But the phone rang again, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. I didn't answer it. I ran. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the house, made my skin crawl. I kept seeing those shadows, hearing that voice in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. A few days later, I got another call. This time, it wasn't from the farmhouse. It was from my own number. When I picked up, there was only silence. And then, a faint whisper. "They're coming for you." That was the last call I ever received. As I write this now, the shadows are creeping closer. I can feel their cold breath on my neck, hear their whispers in the dark. The phone is ringing again, but this time, I know better than to answer. Because once they find you, they never let go. After that call, I tried to return to my normal life, but everything had changed. No matter where I went, I felt them, those shadows, lurking in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. Every night, the phone would ring. It didn't matter if I unplugged it or turned it off. The calls would still come through, and always the same voice. "They're coming for you." I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My mind was unraveling, and I knew it. But what terrified me the most wasn't the calls or the shadows. It was the fact that, deep down, I felt like they were already here. In my home. In my life. Every knock at the door made my heart race. Every flicker of light sent me into a panic. I stopped answering the phone, stopped going to work. I even stopped seeing people. I couldn't explain what was happening, and I knew no one would believe me if I tried. The darkness was closing in. One night, when the phone rang again, I decided to answer it. Maybe it was madness, or maybe I just wanted it all to end. But something pulled me toward that ringing, like a moth to a flame. I picked up the receiver, and the voice on the other end spoke. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. "They're here." I felt a chill run down my spine as the shadows in the room thickened. The lights flickered, and I could hear something moving, something heavy, scraping across the floor. Slowly, I turned around. In the corner of the room stood a figure, dark, twisted, and barely human. Its eyes were black voids, and its face was gaunt, like something long dead but still moving. And it wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, their faces blank, their bodies hunched and broken. They filled the room, surrounding me, their cold, empty eyes fixed on mine. "They've always been here," the voice on the phone said, and this time, I recognized it. It was my own voice. I dropped the phone, the sound of it hitting the floor drowned out by the whispers that filled the room. The shadows closed in, suffocating, wrapping themselves around me like a thick fog. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I realized then that they weren't just coming for me. They had already taken me. Piece by piece, they had wormed their way into my life, into my mind. And now, there was nothing left of me to take. The last thing I remember is the cold, bony hands reaching out from the darkness, pulling me into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, filling my head until there was nothing but noise, an endless, maddening hum. And then, silence. I'm writing this now, but I'm not sure if anyone will ever read it. I'm not even sure if I'm still here. Maybe I've been taken, just like they said I would be. Maybe I'm already gone. The phone hasn't rung in days. The shadows have faded. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I can still hear them. The whispers, faint but persistent, echoing in the back of my mind. They're always watching. I don't know how much longer I have, or if I'll even notice when it happens. But if you're reading this, take my advice. Don't answer the phone. Don't listen to the whispers. Because once they find you, there's no escaping them. I've worked at the old train station for as long as I can remember. It's not the busiest place in town, but it pays the bills. And it's quiet most of the time, just the way I like it. People come and go, heading to different places, but the station itself always stays the same. Empty hallways, creaky floors, and the smell of old wood lingering in the air. One evening, something strange happened. It was a late shift, one of those nights when the fog rolls in thick over the tracks, making everything outside look like it's from another world. I was closing up the ticket booth, counting the cash, and straightening up when I found it. At first, I thought it was just another stub left behind by some careless passenger. But when I picked it up, the paper felt different, older, more fragile, like it had been sitting there for decades. I held it up to the light, squinting at the faded print. Platform 5, departure, 10:00 p.m. Train No. 48. My stomach twisted. Train 48 hadn't run in over 50 years. Everyone in town knew the story. The last time it ran was in 1968, and it never made it to its destination. Disappeared without a trace, passengers and all. The authorities searched the tracks, tunnels, and nearby towns, but they found nothing. It was as if the train had been swallowed by the earth. I stared at the ticket stub, my fingers trembling. The ink had faded, but it was unmistakable. How could it have ended up here, at my booth, after all these years? I glanced at the clock on the wall, 9:45 p.m. A shiver crawled up my spine. It was almost 10:00 p.m., the exact departure time on the ticket. For a second, I considered throwing it away, pretending I never saw it. But something held me back. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. Either way, I couldn't just let it go. I stepped out of the booth, the cool night air brushing against my face as I walked toward Platform 5. It was dark and empty, just like it always was. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the platform floor. I could hear the faint sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the old station walls. Then I heard it. A faint rumble, like the distant sound of a train approaching. My heart started pounding. I looked down the tracks, expecting to see nothing but fog and darkness. But there it was, a train, slowly coming into view, its headlights cutting through the mist. But this wasn't just any train. It was the train, Train 48. The old rusted cars looked like they hadn't moved in decades, covered in dirt and grime. The windows were cracked, and the doors creaked as the train came to a stop in front of me. I stood frozen, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. The train was gone, lost forever. And yet, here it was, right in front of me. The doors slid open with a groan, and a gust of cold air rushed out. It smelled like damp earth and decay, like something long dead had been disturbed. I peered inside, my breath hitching in my throat. The interior was dark, with only faint flickers of light coming from the old broken bulbs hanging from the ceiling. For a moment, I thought I saw someone sitting in the far corner of the car, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, and they were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The clock struck 10:00 p.m. A loud whistle echoed through the station, and before I could move, the train lurched forward. The doors slammed shut, and the wheels screeched against the tracks as it started to pull away. I watched, helpless, as it disappeared into the fog, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. My hand shook as I reached into my pocket, pulling out the old ticket stub. The ink was smudged now, but one thing was clear: the departure time had changed. It now read 10:15 p.m. I stumbled back to the booth, locking the door behind me as my mind raced. What had just happened? Was I losing it? I couldn't shake the feeling that the train wasn't just a ghost from the past. It was a warning. A message, though I couldn't yet understand it. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd find more ticket stubs, each one from a different day and time. All for Train 48. I tried ignoring them, tried throwing them away, but they kept coming back, piling up on my desk no matter what I did. And then, one night, I heard it again, the rumble of the train. But this time, it wasn't just passing through. It was stopping for me. I didn't sleep much after that first night. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my mind. The train, the shadowy figure, the ticket stub that wouldn't leave me alone. I was convinced it had to be a dream, some trick of the mind brought on by the monotony of my job. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The stubs kept coming. At first, it was 1 or 2 a day, but then it became dozens. Different times, different dates, all for Train 48. My ticket booth was starting to look like some sort of shrine to the long-lost passengers. I tried to tell myself to ignore it. I even thought about quitting the job altogether, but something kept pulling me back to the station. It was like the place wouldn't let me go, like I was tied to it somehow. One night, around a week after that first encounter, I was finishing my shift when I heard the sound again. The rumble of the train. It started low, distant, but it was unmistakable. My heart raced as I stepped out of the booth, the fog wrapping around me like a thick blanket. Platform 5 was empty, just like before. But then I saw the light. The headlights cutting through the fog as the train slowly pulled into the station. It was Train 48 again. I stood frozen, watching as it came to a stop in front of me. The doors slid open with a groan, and the smell of decay filled the air once more. My breath caught in my throat as I saw them. Passengers. This time, I could see them clearly, sitting in the dim light of the train car. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, like they had been waiting there for a long, long time. And then, one by one, they turned to look at me. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The doors stayed open, inviting me in. I knew I shouldn't, but something in me, curiosity, fear, maybe even guilt, pushed me forward. I stepped onto the train. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been. The passengers didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched me, their empty eyes following my every step. I walked slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The train groaned and creaked, like it hadn't moved in years, and yet here it was, ready to take me, somewhere. As I moved further into the car, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. At the far end of the car, sitting in one of the old tattered seats, was someone I recognized. It was me. I blinked, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, there I was, sitting there, staring right back at myself. My doppelganger looked worn, tired, like I'd been trapped on this train for decades. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the train jerked forward, and the doors slammed shut behind me. I ran to the nearest door, pounding on it, but it wouldn't budge. The train was moving faster and faster, the fog outside whipping past the windows. My reflection in the window wasn't mine anymore. It was the shadowy figure from before, grinning at me with a wide, unnatural smile. The passengers began to stir, shifting in their seats. Slowly, they stood up, one by one, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I backed away, heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. Why? Why are you here? I stammered, though I didn't expect an answer. But they spoke, in unison, their voices low and echoing, like a chorus from beyond the grave. You missed your train. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what they meant. This train wasn't just for the passengers of Train 48. It was for all those who were lost, who had missed their last chance to move on. And now, it was coming for me. I ran down the aisle, desperate to escape, but every door I tried was locked. The train rattled and groaned, picking up speed as the world outside blurred into darkness. Then, I saw it. At the very end of the car, there was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was cracked open, light spilling out from the other side. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached for the handle, the train lurched, and I stumbled forward, falling through the door into the light. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the station. Everything looked the same, the fog, the empty platforms, but something was different. The air was too still, too quiet. I looked around, expecting to see the ticket booth, the familiar walls of the station, but all I saw were the old rusted tracks stretching off into the distance. The station was gone. I turned, and there it was again. The train, sitting on the tracks, waiting for its next passenger. But this time, I wasn't the ticket seller. I was the one holding the stub. I looked down at my hands, and there it was, crumpled, faded, but clear as day. Train 48, Platform 5. Departure, 10:00 p.m. I had become one of them. The train whistle echoed through the air, and the doors opened, beckoning me inside. I had no choice but to board. As the train pulled away into the fog, I caught one last glimpse of the station in the distance. It faded from view, swallowed by the mist, and I knew I would never see it again. The passengers were silent, their eyes fixed ahead, as the train rumbled on through the night. And I was one of them now, bound to ride the endless tracks forever, waiting for the next ticket. I've been a clock repairer for most of my life. There's something calming about the steady tick of time, the smooth precision of gears, the quiet reassurance that no matter what happens, time keeps moving forward, or at least that's what I thought, until the night the clock stopped. It was an ordinary evening in my shop. The street outside was dimly lit, and the town was quiet, as it usually is after dark. I'd been working late, focusing on a beautiful antique clock that had been giving its owner some trouble. It wasn't anything special to me, just another job that needed finishing. Or so I thought. This particular clock was an old grandfather-style timepiece, tall and imposing, with dark wood and intricate carvings along its frame. The moment I opened it up, I felt something. It wasn't anything I could explain, just a cold sensation, like the air around me had suddenly thinned. The gears inside were old but well maintained. Still, it had stopped ticking at precisely 2:15 a.m. every night, according to the owner. They didn't think much of it, just wanted it fixed. But when I set it back up, carefully adjusted the pendulum, and let it run, I noticed the same thing. At exactly 2:15 a.m., it stopped dead. And I mean dead. No amount of fiddling or resetting could get it going again until the next day. That first night, I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe the mechanisms were faulty in ways I couldn't see. I went home, exhausted, and thought nothing of it. But it happened again, and again. Every night, that clock would stop at exactly 2:15 a.m. Each time, the air felt colder, the silence in my shop heavier. It wasn't just the clock that disturbed me. It was the time itself. You see, 2:15 a.m. wasn't just a random hour for me. It was the exact time my brother had died. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. Who would believe that a clock could stop because of something supernatural? Besides, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But every night, when the hands of that clock froze at 2:15, I could feel something, watching, waiting. I started losing sleep. How could I rest when I knew something was wrong in my shop? Something that had tied itself to me in ways I couldn't understand. One night, I decided to stay in the shop, to watch the clock with my own eyes when it struck 2:15. I remember sitting there in the dim light, feeling the weight of the air around me grow denser as the minute hand crept closer. The ticking was slow, deliberate, like it knew where it was heading. And when the clock finally stopped, I felt it again, something behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew it was there. The air was cold, freezing, and the shop was filled with a stillness that didn't belong. I didn't see anything that night, but I heard it. A faint whisper just behind my ear, though I couldn't make out the words. I left the shop in a hurry, my heart racing, convinced I was losing my mind. I should have stopped there, should have put the clock away, or sent it back to its owner. But I couldn't. Something about that clock drew me in, like it had connected to a part of me I didn't want to face. My brother's death had never made sense. He died suddenly, without explanation, in his sleep. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the clock knew something I didn't. So, I began researching. I went through every document I could find about that clock's history. It had been passed down through generations, belonging to a family that had seen more than its fair share of tragedy. Death followed it, almost like a curse, with every owner losing someone dear. One night, as I sat in front of the clock again, waiting for 2:15, I made a decision. I was going to confront whatever it was. I don't know if I was brave or just stupid, but I needed answers. The shop was dark, save for the faint glow of the clock's face as the hands ticked closer to the dreaded time. My breath was shallow, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as 2:15 approached. The second the clock stopped, I spoke. "Who are you?" For a moment, nothing happened. The room was so silent that I thought I might have imagined everything. But then I felt it. A hand, cold and light, brush against my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I'm sorry," a voice whispered, faint and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. But I knew that voice. It was my brother's. I jumped to my feet, turning to face whatever was behind me. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of the shop, the cold air, and the stopped clock. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. My brother was here, or something pretending to be him. For days after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The clock would stop, as always, but now I'd hear things. Footsteps behind me when I was alone, whispers that faded as soon as I tried to listen. It felt like I was losing my mind. One night, when I had had enough, I took the clock and smashed it into pieces. The wood splintered, the gears scattered across the floor, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. It was over. Or so I thought. The next night, the ticking returned. I woke up to the sound of it, faint at first, but growing louder and louder until it filled my entire house. I scrambled out of bed, searching for the source, but there was no clock. Nothing left of the one I destroyed. But still, the ticking persisted, echoing through the walls, relentless. At 2:15 a.m., the ticking stopped, and the whispers began again. My brother's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. He was everywhere, in every corner, every shadow. I knew then that I couldn't escape. The clock wasn't just a timepiece. It was a doorway, a connection to something beyond, something dark, and I had opened it. My brother's death wasn't an accident. He'd been taken, and now it was my turn. The last thing I remember before the darkness took over was the sound of that clock, ticking endlessly in the back of my mind, as if time itself had come for me. I write this now, knowing that soon I'll be gone. Time always catches up with you in the end. As the days passed, the ticking followed me everywhere I went. I heard it in the silence of my shop, in the quiet of my home, even when I was outside, away from everything that reminded me of clocks. It became my constant companion, never letting me forget. At first, It was just annoying, like a noise you can't block out. But it got worse. The ticking grew louder, more insistent. It pounded in my ears until every second felt like a hammer against my skull. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep. My world had shrunk down to just me and the sound of time. I tried to explain it to people, friends, neighbors, even a doctor. But who would believe that a clock, a broken clock, could follow me? That it could haunt me like this? They looked at me like I was crazy, their polite nods and empty reassurances only deepening my isolation. No one could help me, not even myself. One night, I decided to confront it once and for all. I stayed awake, sitting in the dark with the clock pieces spread out before me on the floor. The ticking was so loud I could barely think, but I knew I had to finish this. I grabbed the broken gears, the shattered wood, and pieced it back together, like I was trying to stitch my sanity together with it. As I worked, I realized something terrifying. The hands of the clock weren't just stopping at 2:15. They were pointing to something else, a time beyond that. Each night, they inched closer and closer to a new time, a final time. And I knew that when they reached it, it would all be over for me. I finished repairing the clock just as 2:15 struck. My hand shook as I placed it back on the shelf, the ticking filling the room once again. But this time, something was different. The cold returned, stronger than ever. It wasn't just a chill in the air. It was a deep, bone-deep cold that froze me in place. The room darkened, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, reaching for me. I tried to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped. And then I saw him. My brother stood in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He looked like he had when we buried him, except now, he wasn't resting. He was here, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Sadness, anger, regret. I didn't know. I tried to warn you, he whispered, his voice like the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. You shouldn't have brought it back. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My throat was tight, fear paralyzing every muscle in my body. The ticking of the clock grew louder, pounding in my head like a countdown to something terrible. My brother took a step toward me, his hand outstretched. It's not just me, you know, he said softly. It's all of us. We're all waiting. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. What do you mean? Waiting for what? For you, he said, his voice so cold it felt like ice. It's your turn. The room began to spin, the shadows swallowing the light until I was plunged into darkness. The ticking continued, faster now, frantic, as if it was racing toward something I couldn't escape. And then, at exactly 2:15, the clock stopped. In that moment, everything went silent. The ticking, the whispers, even the sound of my own breath, gone. I stood there, frozen in place, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The cold faded, the darkness lifted, and I was left standing alone in the middle of my shop, the clock still and silent on the shelf. I thought it was over. I thought I had won. But then, I felt it. A hand, cold as death, wrapped around my wrist. I looked down, and my brother's hand was there, gripping me tightly. His face was gone, his body nothing more than a shadow, but his hand remained, pulling me toward the clock. No, I whispered, trying to pull away. No, please. But it was too late. The shadows closed in around me. The ticking started again, and I knew there was no escaping it. Time had run out. I'm not sure what happened after that. I think I'm still here somewhere, caught between the ticks of the clock, trapped in a place where time doesn't move the way it should. I can hear the ticking, always in the background, always counting down to something I'll never understand. I don't know if anyone will find this, or if they'll believe it if they do. But if you're reading this, listen to me. Don't fix the clock. Don't let it into your life. Because once it's there, it never leaves. And neither will you. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, not until I experienced it firsthand. My name is Ava, And I've been working as a seamstress for over 20 years. Sewing has always been a late-night affair for me. The quiet hours offer the solitude I need to focus. But what happened that one night? Well, I wish I had never stayed. My workshop was my sanctuary, filled with dummies, fabrics, and half-finished garments. The dummies had been there for as long as I could remember, standing like silent sentinels watching over my work. One, in particular, was special. A dummy dressed in a half-stitched gown I was working on for weeks. The night it all began, I was engrossed in my sewing, the soft hum of the machine a rhythm that kept me calm. I glanced up at the dummy, out of habit, just to check the fit of the dress. It had moved. I blinked hard, assuming I was just tired. After all, I'd been at it for hours. But when I looked away and glanced back a moment later, the dummy had shifted again, its angle, its posture, as if it was trying to face me. I sat there, staring at the dummy, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the shadows, or the way the fabric draped over it, but the more I tried to rationalize it, the more uneasy I became. It wasn't just the dummy's posture that had changed, it was the direction it was facing. Earlier, its blank face was pointed toward the corner of the room, but now it seemed to be angled toward me, almost like it was watching. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was just imagining things. I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The air felt heavier, the silence too thick, almost as if I could hear something faint. Something breathing. Get a grip, Ava, I muttered to myself, focusing back on the stitches. But the feeling didn't go away. Every few minutes, I glanced up at the dummy, and each time it had shifted just a little more. First, it was subtle, a slight tilt of the head, a different angle in its stance. But then, it was facing me directly. I couldn't work anymore. My hands trembled, and the machine's hum was no longer comforting. I pushed my chair back, my heart pounding in my chest as I got up to inspect the dummy. There was no reason for it to move. No one else was in the room. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the fabric. It felt cold, colder than it should have been. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. One of the other dummies had fallen over, knocking over a rack of clothes with it. But I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been near it. My eyes darted back to the dummy I'd been inspecting, and that's when I noticed something even more horrifying. It wasn't standing on its base anymore. My breath hitched, and without thinking, I rushed to the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, the panic rising as I yanked the door open and fled down the hallway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to know if the dummy had followed me. I bolted out into the street, the cold night air stinging my face. The streetlights flickered above me, and the world seemed eerily silent. I needed to calm down, but the fear clung to me like a second skin. I wandered through the empty streets, trying to shake the terror. That's when I found myself at the train station. I hadn't planned on going there, but my feet had carried me, almost as if something was guiding me. The old station had long since fallen into disuse, but there was always one man who stayed behind. He was the ticket seller, an elderly man with graying hair and tired eyes. He'd been there for as long as I could remember, and no matter how empty the station became, he still sat behind the counter, waiting for trains that never came. I approached the counter, my pulse still racing from the incident at the shop. The man looked up at me, his gaze distant yet knowing. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice raspy from years of disuse. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. You ever see anything strange around here?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "Depends on what you mean by strange. This place has seen its fair share of odd things." I leaned against the counter, trying to calm myself. "What kind of things?" The ticket seller didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out something small, sliding it across the surface toward me. It was a ticket stub, worn, faded, and brittle with age. "This," he said quietly, was left behind tonight. I frowned, picking it up and examining it. The paper felt ancient, as though it had been sitting in the station for decades. The date on it was from over 50 years ago, and it was for a train that no longer ran. Who left this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes seemed to darken. That's the thing. I didn't see anyone. Just found it lying here when I came back from a break. A chill ran down my spine. There was no logical explanation for how an old ticket from a defunct train ended up in a modern-day station. I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. I've seen tickets like this before, the man continued, his voice low and grave. And every time I do, something bad happens. I looked up at him, the fear creeping back into my chest. What do you mean? He sighed deeply, glancing around the empty station. People vanish. Or worse. I don't know how or why, but every time a ticket like that shows up, it's followed by something unnatural. I dropped the ticket back onto the counter as if it had burned me. Why are you still here then? Why keep working in a place like this? The man shrugged, his expression resigned. Some things can't be escaped. Besides, I don't think leaving would change anything. It's already here. Before I could ask what he meant, a distant sound caught my attention. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the low, rumbling whistle of a train. My blood turned to ice. That's impossible, I whispered. There haven't been any trains here in decades. The man's face was grim. It's coming. We both turned toward the tracks, and sure enough, a light appeared in the distance. The whistle grew louder, the sound piercing the still night air. The ground beneath us trembled as the old train station seemed to come to life for the first time in years. My heart pounded in my chest as the train rolled into view, its rusted metal cars screeching against the rails. It didn't look like any modern train. It was old, decrepit, covered in grime and dust, as if it had been traveling through time itself. The doors creaked open with a deafening groan, and for a moment, everything went silent. I turned to the ticket seller, but he was already backing away, his face pale. Don't get on that train, no matter what. I didn't need to be told twice, but as I backed away from the platform, something caught my eye. Standing by one of the doors was a figure. No, several figures. They were motionless, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me. And then I recognized one of them. It was the dummy from my shop. The sight of the dummy, standing as still as ever but unmistakably out of place, froze me in my tracks. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. How could it have followed me here? And why was it with those shadowy figures by the train? I stepped back further, my breath catching in my throat. The ticket seller stood behind me, his face white as a sheet. I told you, he muttered. It's already here. The figures on the platform didn't move, but their presence weighed heavily on me. My legs felt like lead, and I could hardly breathe. The whistle of the train blared again, louder this time, urging me to make a decision. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. The ticket seller grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the platform. We need to leave. Now. I barely registered his words, my eyes locked on the dummy that had been haunting me all night. It was standing, motionless as ever, but there was something new about it. The dress it was wearing, the one I'd been working on, was now fully stitched, as if my work had been completed by unseen hands. Worse still, the figure's face seemed to shift slightly, taking on the contours of a person. Of me. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. No, this can't be real. The ticket seller didn't give me time to argue. He dragged me away, toward the station's exit, but as we moved, I heard the slow, deliberate footsteps of the figures behind us. I glanced back, my heart thudding in my chest. The dummy was walking. I let out a scream, but it was drowned out by the screech of the train's brakes as it came to a complete stop. The doors slid open with an ominous hiss, and more figures emerged, all of them featureless shadows, moving in unison toward us. We have to go, the ticket seller shouted, pulling me harder. We reached the exit, but the heavy iron gates slammed shut before we could get through. The sound echoed through the station, and I spun around only to see the figures closing in. The dummy was leading them now, its once lifeless limbs moving with purpose. I could no longer deny it. The thing was alive, and it was coming for me. I backed into the ticket seller, both of us cornered against the gate. "What do we do?" I gasped, my eyes wide with terror. His face was grim. "There's nothing we can do." The figures advanced, their steps slow but steady. The ticket seller's grip on my arm loosened, and when I looked at him, I realized he had given up. "I've seen this before," he whispered. "Once the ticket is issued, it's over." I stared at him, my mind racing. The ticket. The old, crumbling stub he had handed me earlier. I pulled it from my pocket, the paper cold and brittle in my hand. "Is this what they want?" The ticket seller nodded weakly. "It's always the same. The ticket is your invitation." I stared at the stub in disbelief. An invitation to what? Before he could answer, the figures were upon us. The dummy reached out, its stiff fingers grasping for me. I recoiled, but there was nowhere left to run. The ticket seller stood frozen beside me, his eyes glassy with fear. "Get on the train," a voice said. It wasn't the ticket seller's, nor was it coming from the figures. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it rang out clear and commanding. "Get on the train, Ava." I shook my head, my body trembling. "No, I can't." But the dummy reached out again, this time its hand closing around my wrist. The coldness of its touch sent a shock through my entire body, and in that moment I knew I had no choice. The train had come for me. With shaking legs, I stepped forward. The figures parted as I moved toward the open doors, and I felt their eyes, if they even had eyes, watching me. The ticket seller stayed behind, still rooted to the spot, his face pale and lifeless. I crossed the threshold into the train, the air inside thick and musty, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The seats were old, cracked leather, and the windows were so caked with grime that no light could pass through. The door slammed shut behind me, and the train lurched forward. I stumbled down the aisle, trying to keep my balance as the train picked up speed. I glanced behind me, hoping to see some way out, but the figures from the platform were now on board, standing silently at the back of the car. I rushed to the nearest window, desperately trying to see where we were headed, but the landscape outside was nothing but darkness. There were no buildings, no streets, no signs of life, just an endless black void. Panic set in, and I turned back toward the front of the train, hoping to find some way to stop it. But as I moved through the cars, I realized something horrifying. I wasn't alone. Each car was filled with passengers, people dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and gaunt. They sat in their seats, unmoving, their eyes staring straight ahead. Some of them held ticket stubs like mine, their hands clutching the brittle paper as if it were the only thing keeping them tethered to this world. I tried to speak to them, but none of them responded. They didn't even blink. And then I saw her. Sitting in the very last seat of the car was a woman I hadn't noticed before. She was dressed in a gown that looked exactly like the one I had been working on for weeks. Her head was bent low, her long hair covering her face. Slowly, she lifted her head, and I saw her eyes. They were my eyes. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile that chilled me to the bone. "You took too long," she whispered. "You should have finished it." The train screeched to a halt, throwing me off balance. I slammed into the wall of the car, gasping for breath as the doors hissed open again. But when I looked outside, there was no platform, no station, just a barren, desolate landscape of nothingness. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't going back. The doors closed, and the train began to move again, carrying me deeper into the void. The woman in the gown stared at me from her seat, her eyes locked on mine. There was no escape. Working at the Westbridge Hotel wasn't the worst job I'd ever had. In fact, most days were pretty mundane. Cleaning rooms, changing sheets, and restocking toiletries. But there was one room that always sent a chill down my spine. Room 305. No one else seemed to notice, but something about that room was off. And the towels. God, the towels were always wet. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe I'd forgotten to check the towels after the last guest. Or maybe one of the other maids had left them damp by mistake. But then it started happening even when the room hadn't been occupied for days. I'd walk into 305, ready to clean, and there they were, soggy towels, as if someone had just stepped out of the shower. But the bathroom was bone dry. No water on the floor, no damp smell, just those wet towels. I mentioned it to Carol, one of the senior maids. She just shrugged it off, said it was probably the plumbing. But I knew better. I checked the pipes myself. No leaks, nothing wrong. Maintenance didn't find anything either. Still, every time I went into 305, those towels would be wet. Even weirder, the water wasn't warm like you'd expect. It was cold. Icy cold, like it had been soaked in something other than just water. Weeks went by, and I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I tried to avoid the room whenever I could, hoping someone else would take care of it. But eventually, I always had to go back. The hotel wasn't that big, and we were often short-staffed. Every time I entered 305, the feeling got worse. There was always this strange pressure, like the air was thicker in there, and sometimes I thought I could hear water dripping. Only, when I checked, there wasn't any running water at all. I finally decided to do some digging. I asked Carol about the room's history, but she brushed me off. Nothing strange about 305, she said, but I didn't believe her. I went to the front desk manager, who'd been there for years. Mr. Harris was usually friendly, but when I mentioned the room, his face darkened. "We don't talk about 305, he muttered, and walked away before I could ask any more questions. It wasn't until I spoke with one of the older maids, Agnes, that I learned the truth. Back in the 90s, she told me, a woman stayed in that room. She never checked out. Agnes lowered her voice. They found her in the bathtub, drowned. But the strange thing was, the water was gone when they found her. The tub was bone dry, but her body was soaked through. My stomach twisted as she continued. Some say she did it herself. Others think someone else was involved. But whatever happened, that room hasn't been right since. From that moment on, I couldn't look at 305 the same way. The next time I was assigned to clean it, I hesitated at the door, keys jangling in my hand. The air felt colder as I stepped inside, the quiet hum of the hallway replaced by an eerie silence. My eyes went straight to the bathroom. I could feel something in there, lurking just beyond sight. The towels were wet again, of course, but this time there was something different. As I reached out to pick one up, I noticed the wet pattern on the towel wasn't random. It looked like a handprint. I dropped it instantly, my heart racing. I told myself I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Guests staying in 305 started complaining. One man said he felt like someone was watching him the whole time. A woman checked out early after hearing splashing noises from the bathroom in the middle of the night, even though no one was there. Some of the other maids refused to clean it, saying they'd had nightmares about drowning after their shifts. But the worst part was when I started seeing things. It was subtle at first, a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, a faint reflection in the mirror. One evening while cleaning, I glanced up and saw a figure in the mirror behind me. She was pale, her hair dripping wet. Her eyes locked on mine. I spun around, but there was no one there. The next time I cleaned 305, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to finish quickly, but as I bent down to pick up the towels, I noticed something even more disturbing. The water on the floor wasn't random. It seemed to trail from the tub, where a fine crack had appeared, down to the door. I backed away, heart pounding, and ran out of the room. I had to know more. That night, I searched the hotel archives and found the police report from the drowning incident. The woman's name was Emily Donovan. She'd been staying in the hotel for a business trip, but something had gone horribly wrong. According to the report, she'd been found submerged in the tub, water pouring out, as if someone had just left her there. But no evidence of foul play had ever been found. The next day, I went back to 305, determined to face whatever was haunting the room. As soon as I stepped inside, I could hear it, water dripping, faint but steady. It came from the bathroom, even though the faucets were all off. I took a deep breath and walked in. The room felt even colder, and the light above flickered as if it might go out any moment. As I stared at the tub, I could see the water rising. It filled slowly without any source, like the tub was pulling it from somewhere else. Then I saw her, Emily. She was standing in the water, her eyes locked on me, and this time I couldn't look away. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her anger, her sadness. She reached out toward me, and I felt my body freeze. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the water rushing faster. It began to rise, covering the floor, soaking into my shoes. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The water climbed higher and higher, and I could feel the cold seep into my bones. Emily stepped closer, her hand inches from my face. The room was filling now, the water up to my chest. I was drowning. I thrashed and kicked, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The last thing I saw was Emily's face, inches from mine. As the water dragged me under, everything went black. The next morning, Carol found the room empty. The towels were wet, of course. They always were.